we have now this guy in the modern day claiming to be the Mahdi, right? So this concept is now bubbling up. So there's this guy claiming to be Mahdi over the entire history of the Islamic region. There were many people who called themselves Mahdi. It then takes on this eschatological meaning. It then gets expanded in the Hadith traditions to essentially be this promised figure that is to come, is linked with eschatological aspects. However, the crucial problem, though, is that it's not in the Quranic text itself. There is no Mahdi in the Quran. So that begs the question, okay? If the Shias and Sunnis both have this idea of the Mahdi, then it isn't some sectarian later, development. It seems to go all the way back to the original early 7th century, if not before. So the question then is, okay, how is it that there's this consistently among Shia and Sunni alike developed and adhered to tradition of a Mahdi coming when it's not in the Quranic text? So JC, what do you think about that? Just that general gist. Like we have a Mahdi idea, but it's not in the Quran.
That is an interesting question. I saw the Mahdi as being the character promised to the Shia more than the Sunnis, because they think that the Mahdi is like the 12th Imam who went into exile in 932 or 9936, something like that. And at one point he returns, and we know what needs to happen before he returns. And then he brings forth like the true Quran, which was not altered by Uthman and all of those things. So it's bizarre, and people have actually appeared saying that they are the Mahdi, particularly one now trending on social media, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I know kind of the punchline of this, that Mahdi was originally introduced in the Quran, but now hidden, right?
It's ironic, yeah. And the Shia idea of the Mahdi, where they elevate it for this particular instance, right? Because they have their 12 Imams, but obviously once the 12th Imam is there, how do you have a 13th Imam when the framework is that there are these 12? Then the idea is then this 12th one was the Mahdi, then he went into hiding, and then he will return, right? So the Shia have their particularized, this is the Mahdi who will return. However, we don't have we do have a Mahdi idea in Sunni, right? It's Sunni in East. They just don't identify this Mahdi figure as being the 12th Imam who will come back. So it's this shared idea. They differ about the particulars, but the Mahdi idea it does unite the Shias and Sunnis. But again, where does this concept come from? So here's a segment, which is the text we're going to be looking at. We're looking specifically at verse 29, which is cut off at the end. But I'm going to read this out. That way we get the gist of the context, so that when we go into it, we know what we're talking about. So this is in Surah 19, Surah Maryam. And I'll read from the top. That way we get the full context. So this is from the Murad translation. So some of the words are going to be left as question marks, and I will read them as such. We're just going to not worry about them for now. So she bore him and then discarded herself by him into a remote place. So this is after the birth of Jesus, presumably. And then we get, so the birth pangs made her come unto the trunk of the palm tree. She said, "Oh, blank, died before this and were a forgotten forgetfulness." So he called her from beneath her, that do not grieve thy Lord, has already rendered a blank beneath thee, presumably related to Christ somehow. And vibrate unto thee by the trunk of the palm tree, it shall continuously drop moist blank over thee. So eat and drink, settle eye-wise, so either thou see any one from the mortal having skin, then say, surely I have vowed a fasting for al-rahman, so I will never talk to a human being today. So she advanced by him, her menfolk, bearing him. They said, O Maryam, indeed thou hast come a fabricated thing. This is in the Murad. When it goes to the Sin translations of that particular fabricated quote-unquote thing, there's more to be said about that, and I have investigated that, but we'll leave that out for now. But it's related to Christ, essentially. There's something, whether it's fabricated or whether it's wonderful. Basically, if you look at the Sin translations, one translator will say monstrous thing, the other will say amazing thing. So this word is definitely dubious, given the fact that the translators can't agree upon it. So we continue. This is where it gets important. O sister of Harun. So this is already kind of an issue. People talk about it a lot, about why is Mary associated as the sister of Harun. There's multiple explanations that are provided. One of them is, it's symbolically a brother, yada, yada, yada. But we'll put that aside for now. O sister of Aaron, thy father was not an affront of gentlemen, and thy mother was not intrusive. So she referred unto him. They said, how should we talk with he who was a boy in the smoothness, is how Murad finishes that. And that's the verse we're going to be looking at. So the context here is there's the birth of Christ, then there's like, Mary goes to a remote place after giving birth to him or bearing him. So maybe after conception, then she discards her place, and essentially this is all post-birth of Christ. There's something about al-rahman with fasting and so forth. But now the context is we have Mary referring to him. This is Christ. And we read this as it being a boy, as we see in Murad, because of the word Sabian. So let's have a look specifically at this verse, 19-29, where it starts with how, this is in the middle of the verse, but we're specifically focusing on this part here. And it reads, well, this verse, here's the manuscript. The reference is for the Wettstein 1913. This is the one we're going to be looking at specifically for the presentation today. So we're looking first at this word just to go through. That way everything is firmly attested. Okay, Kaifa, I looked at this in the Syriac. I think it's also attested in Aramaic, Syriac. So this seems pretty solid. So it's how. It's rendered very consistently as how and throughout the Quranic text. So we can be pretty confident. So how. Next word is this Nun Kaf Lam Mim, which is Kaf Lam Mim root, which is the kalimat, right? The word of God. So kalam is word, speech, right? So nu kalamin would be we speak. So that's how it's rendered here. We speak. Okay, fair enough. Continue. Min. This one is it can be used either from or who. So we can see it's attested very consistently as who. So we can be happy with that. Okay. Kana is an interesting word. I'm just putting it up here as a point of interest as well, which is the fact that we have kana attested in the Syriac, in the Gez, and in the Arabic. However, they don't act the same way, so it is worth noting, because in past streams we pointed out how the translators will render kana as present tense, even though the proper Arabic for kana is actually that it's past tense. However, that said, in the Syriac and in the Gez, the form kana is actually itself present tense, which is interesting because if we're going to put forward that a lot of the meanings derive from the Syriac, from the Gez, then even kana itself, where we're critical of the Islamic translators when they put it as present tense, and we say no, we insist you translate it properly according to Arabic grammar and say that this is past tense. Even that itself is a little bit dubious and worth investigating. And of course, I put the screenshot here where you can see the exact same form, the same diacritics, and in one instance it's translated as is, and then 4 verses later you see it's translated as was. So there's no consistency actually in how the Arabic translators translate kana, which is a bit messy. But that's the word we're dealing with here. So to point out of interest is that it takes the meaning of dwell as well, which is a side meaning, but maybe relevant, right? So the next word is one of these other words which is quite consistent. This is the word fi. It means in. Fair enough, simple. Now we're looking at the more difficult words. And I want to go over what Tabari actually writes. And he's already like roughly almost 200 years essentially after the emergence of the textual tradition. So we're now already in the year, well, actually, no, it's more like almost 300 years rather. So we're in the year 915 here, where it supposedly was finished, and even that, we get the manuscripts later, so, but we can attest. Okay, the point being here is that the earliest tafsir writer, which is Tabari, he doesn't really know what it means. It's simply used by caliphs and rebels alike. However, it's not clear what exactly it means. Okay, so let's look at the root itself. So the root, when you look at the concordance for the root, you see various forms in different contexts. So one meaning it takes up is the resting place. However, this is written differently, right? You see that when you have it is the resting place here, it has an extra aleph. And when you see it here as taking the meaning of the cradle down here, That's the form we're looking at. Alif, lam, mim, ha, dal. So if you have the extra alif, it actually changes the root. So it might be related, but it's probably a different root. It has probably a different meaning. So we're looking specifically at this whole cradle word, which appears as the meaning of cradle 3 times in Surah 3, 5, and 19. We're looking at the one in 19 specifically here. As well as, interestingly, we see that it also appears in another form, where instead of the alif lam definite article, it seems that it has essentially another occurrence, but instead of the alif lam, we have the alif suffix, which could tie into our thesis about the definite articles. That being that the Aramaic suffix a would then be rendered essentially into the alif lam definite article. This thesis would essentially say that these words are identical, if that is correct. But
If
for now,
I may jump in
yes.
just for a second. So in the word as it is rendered now as Mahdi, the E sound is accomplished through the fatha that is added, of course, probably 9th or 10th century. So the word as written in the Quran, it will probably be read as Mahda, because they wouldn't have the sound E unless they otherwise would have probably added a Ya. So this one that you said that it ends with an alif might actually be closer to the original rendering of the word than Mahdi with the ending Y. Just that observation.
That's very interesting also, yeah. True. Okay, because then it would retain the memory of the pronunciation. The phonetic would retain, but the meaning is lost. Interesting. Okay, yeah, fair enough. So we're looking then at this Mahdi word, but so I want to first show other context. So the initial counter argument, if I were to propose that Mahdi, by the way, it's pronounced Mahdi because, like you said, you have the diacritic on the final D here, right? So you actually pronounce it Mahdi, right? But it's not meant to be connected to al-Mahdi, right? Pronunciation is no different given this diacritical, putting of the I sound as a diacritic here. So that's why it initially caught my attention, simply because of the phonetic similarity. So in the context of Mahdi, the right away the counter argument will be, well, of course it's cradle, because in the context of Surah 5, verse 110, we see Mahdi in this other place, where in the context it reads, "My favor upon you and upon your mother." So it's clearly about Jesus. "When I strengthened you with the spirit of holiness." I don't see it on my own end. I have to move this other way. Okay, yeah. The spirit of holiness. So yes, okay, it's definitely about Jesus. Okay, fair enough. So then it says, "You spoke al-nas," which I have questions about. But anyway, to the people, "Fi in the cradle," right? So the idea here is that, it must mean cradle, because this other word after, wakalan, means maturity. So by contrast, because one means maturity, and in the context it would presumably mean that therefore he's talking to people in youth and in maturity, therefore youth is represented by cradle here, and that makes sense of it, presumably. However, I looked at this other word, the word for maturity. And one moment, just gonna get back on the slides here. This word is quite interesting in the sense that I would identify it. We spoke before of rotten roots. I would identify this as a case of a rotten root, because we have this source in the Hebrew scriptures of this idea of the assembly or the congregation, and this is used then more and more emphasized in contexts of God, as in God's assembly, as in in His presence, in His domain, right? His assembly, His congregation. So the QHL, then phonetically, the kaf in the Hebrew very often becomes the K in the Aramaic and the Syriac and so on. So you can see that development, right? So you can track the origin coming from the QHL root in the Hebrew scriptures. Then it takes the phonetic and representation in the Aramaic and Syriac as KHL, therefore deriving the meaning directly from the Hebrew as being assembly, congregation, multitude. However, then we get, Ethiopic, stays faithful, congregation, assembly, it's used liturgically, right? And then we get to Arabic, and it's a totally different meaning. It means to be a middle-aged, mature man. I couldn't explain why. But that's what it means. It's not used for assembly. So I say, no, we take the overwhelming majority consensus of what this root means, which is assembly. So therefore, when we're looking at "my favor upon you," yada yada, when you spoke to the people in the cradle, right? And the justification, of course, is because wakalan means middle-aged man, you see, Aki. Well, if we understand this as being assembly, that opens up what this other word would mean. How am I going to explain this now? So assembly, right? If this is to take the meaning, what I put here, right, of the company of heaven, or the assembly of heaven, then it would be the true body of the righteous gathered before God, or the eternal communion of the elect. So this would be, in a sense, in heaven, so beyond the earthly world. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is that if we then understand this not as maturity, right, but instead as assembly, and we then keep this open as potentially what it could be, then it's that he spoke to people in something, and then also in the assembly in heaven. Okay, just putting that as a framework because there's a lot of floating parts here, and I'll get back to it. So, what does the Gez say about this Mahdi or Hadi or Hadda? And by the way, back to what you were saying about how it's most likely going to be pronounced in the original rendering as Mahada, right? That's what we see here as the phonetic actually being Mahada. Hadu. Okay, and the reason why I'm putting this down here, right, is because potentially it's talking about return, because the Hadda root in the in the Abyssinian, so in the Gez, in the Ethiopic, has the meaning of returning or to come back to. And if you put the min, then it becomes return as such. And then this is a broader form that's not actually what we see in the Quranic text, but I was going to put it here anyway as like the one who returns, hypothetically. But that's rendered with the Gez grammar. So I kind of want to put the idea of the returning one in everyone's minds as potentially derived from the Ethiopic through the root of Hadda as returning to. And then here, if we understand it also similarly, then it would say something along the lines of how we speak who was or is in, and then these are potentially options here, in the returner, in the returning as such, in the rightly guided one, to sort of, have the Tabari kind of implicit association. And then we have desired, or wished, or hoped for, or immersed, baptized, or poured out, overflowing. So this is the rendering I'm leaning towards, how we speak to who was in the returning one baptized.